So in this video, we're going to be taking a more in-depth look at the oscillator that comes in the Moog Mother32. Now, we have one oscillator here, which is toggleable between a saw and a pulse wave, and it's a VCO or voltage controlled oscillator, as opposed to a more modern style DCO or digitally controlled oscillator. Now, there's not a huge difference between these two things, but a VCO, because it's entirely analog controlled, controlling its pitch, it tends to have a little bit of wobble and fluctuation in its pitch, which means it has more warmth, a little more inherent movement than a DCO, but isn't quite as accurate and as clean. And depending on what you're doing, that can be better or worse. But in this case, we've got that VCO. We have that inherent oscillation and warmness kind of baked in. So if we jump onto the front of the Moog, we can see the oscillator section we've already looked at on the top left here. Now, the first control is the frequency control, which is basically just a tuning control. We can use that to change the inherent tuning of the Moog, so we can tune them with other instruments. We can also use that for special laser effects and kind of zapping noises and things like that. And next up, we have the VCO wave toggle switch. On the bottom, that'll give us a nice saw wave, which you can see on the oscilloscope. And if we toggle it up, we will get a pulse wave. Now, next to the VCO wave control, we have the pulse width control. And the pulse width control basically changes the width of the high and the low sections of a pulse wave to get very different timbres or tones out of that one oscillator. If you watch the oscillator, as I turn the pulse width control, you'll actually be able to see this really clearly. And if I turn that control from the center to the left, you can see that the left-hand side shrinks and the right-hand side gets bigger, but also smaller. And if I move it all the way to the right, you can see it does the same thing in the opposite direction. In both extremes of that control, you get this very high, thin kind of nasal sound that can be really useful. And in the middle, you basically get a traditional square wave. And there are lots of things that you can do with synths, basically modulating this to add depth or richness to a pulse wave. Next to that control, we have the mix control. By default, on the left-hand side of this mix control, we're getting the oscillator. But on the right-hand side, we're getting a built-in noise oscillator that just samples noise from the circuitry. You can hear a nice kind of white or pink noise there, which can be very useful for percussion and things like that. Below the frequency control, we have the glide control. And what this does is it changes the rate at which the oscillator will change pitch when you play different notes. So if it's turned all the way to the left, as I play different notes, the oscillators just snap immediately to the new pitch. But as I turn that up, they start to move slower and slower. You can see this adds a really interesting kind of slidey bendiness to it, and the glide controls on a lot of mono synths like this are really important to giving expression and nuance to the sound that they might not otherwise have. Below that, we have some built-in modulation options for the VCO, which we can connect to the envelopes or the LFO. Now, I'm going to show you one simple but really useful trick we can pull with this oscillator and the patch bay over here. By default, we can only choose either the saw wave or the pulse wave, but we can actually access both of them at the same time in the patch bay. So if I grab a couple of patch cables and connect it here to the VCO saw output, that is taking the saw wave output of the oscillator regardless of which position the switch is in. So if I put the switch up to pulse wave, but take the saw and I connect that to the external audio input in the very top left of the patch bay, that external audio input actually overrides the white noise here. You can see it says noise/external. And what that means is on the left-hand side of the mix control, we have the pulse wave, but on the right-hand side of the mix control, we have the saw wave. so we can use that mix control to blend those two oscillator sounds together at the same time. So that's pretty much everything you need to know about the oscillator section. It's a really beautiful oscillator, but it's quite a simple thing to deal with. In the next video, we'll be taking an in-depth look at the filters that are built into the Mother 32.